The snow had been falling since dawn, a quiet veil drifting across the high country, as if the mountains themselves wished to bury all traces of human struggle beneath a white shroud. Each flake clung to her lashes, melting slowly into drops that stung her eyes, but she did not wipe them away. Her hands were full of the bundle which she had gathered, branches brittle and sharp against her skin. She bent forward into wind, dark braids lashing across her cheeks, her breath a pale cloud that faded quickly into the vast stillness. Behind her lay the small settlement, a clutch of cabins pressed into the valley floor, smoke rising thin from their chimneys. She knew the whispers there still followed her, even out here where only the wolves and the wind had a voice. Their judgment was not loud, but had weight. It pressed against her back like the cold. Some called her cursed. Others said she carried too much blood not her own, that she was neither one thing nor the other. And when women gathered near the well, they would fall silent when she passed, watching with eyes sharp as needles. She had grown used to the sting of it, yet sometimes, in the deepest hours of night when the snow lay heavy on the roof and the world was swallowed in silence, she would remember the words with sharpness that felt like blades across her skin. Barren to love, unfit for hearth or child, too strange to belong. Fertile, they had said once, but not as blessing. Fertile like wild ground no one dared to till, because what might grow there could not be trusted. Her boots crunched over the hard-packed snow as she climbed a slope of fir and pine. The branches bowed low under the weight of winter, needles bending as though weary from carrying too much. The sound of her steps was the only rhythm in the woods, until another reached her ears, soft, deliberate, not the noise of deer nor fox. She froze, the bundle of sticks slipping slightly from her grip. From the edge of the trees, a figure appeared. At first only a shadow against a gray flurry, then more solid, more real. A man stepped into the pale clearing, taller than most, broad of shoulder, his coat ragged with wear and fringed with ice. His beard was thick, his hair long, tangled with flakes of snow. He looked as though he had walked out of the mountain itself, carved from stone and bark, rough as the wilderness that sheltered him. She did not move. Her pulse climbed into her throat. Men in town spoke of him, the wild one who lived alone, the one who seldom came down from the heights. Some swore he had lived among wolves. Others said he had gone mad from too many winters without another soul. He was danger. He was strange in his given form. The man stopped a few paces away, his eyes pale beneath the shadow of his brow, watching her as one watches a creature uncertain whether to flee. The snow hissed in the air between them. She drew a sharp breath, clutching the bundle of wood tighter, though she knew it was no shield. When he spoke, his voice was low, roughened by disuse, but clear enough to carry in the frozen air. "I can smell your fertile." The word struck her with the force of a slap. Heat surged to her face despite the cold. Her first thought was flight, turn, run, vanish into the trees. Yet her body betrayed her, rooted to the snow, her breath shallow and fast. Shame flooded her, quick and cruel. The town had whispered such things behind her back, but never had anyone spoken it so plain, so naked of malice yet heavy with truth. It was not accusation, not exactly, but it stripped her bare as surely as if he had torn the clothes from her shoulders. Her eyes darted toward him, searching his face for mockery, yet his expression was unreadable, carved from weather and solitude. He said it as a hunter names a track, as a wolf scents the air. A statement, not a judgment. Still, the words dug into her bones, awakening the old sting of rejection. She wanted to spit at him, to tell him he was no better than the gossips who trailed her shadow. Yet beneath the sting, another feeling stirred, uneasy, unbidden. Something in the way he looked at her, as though he saw not shame but a truth unhidden. It frightened her more than cruelty might have. The wind shifted, and she realized how far the storm had crept upon her. Snow whirled thick now, biting her cheeks. The path back to the settlement had vanished beneath white drifts. She shivered, not only from cold but from the sudden knowledge that she was alone with this man, bound to the same wilderness. He moved first, turning slightly toward the line of trees. "Storm's thickening," he said, voice gruff. "You'll not make it back before dark." Her mouth opened, words failing her. She wanted to refuse, to insist she would find her way, But another gust of wind clawed through her coat, and the thought of wandering blind into the storm sent a spear of dread through her chest. Without waiting for her answer, he started toward the trees. His stride was sure unhurried, as though the snow were nothing. She lingered, torn between pride and fear, then followed, clutching her bundle like a talisman. The wood swallowed them, branches bending low, snow sifting down in curtains. The man led without speaking, and she trailed him in silence, watching the steady breath of his shoulders, the way he pushed through the drifts without effort. His presence unsettled her, yet it carried weight, a gravity that pulled her forward against reason. They came at last to a hollow where a fire pit lay buried under snow, a rough shelter of logs and canvas pitched against the wind. He swept snow aside with his arm, crouched to strike flint against steel. Sparks leapt, smoke rose, and soon a small fire licked at the cold air. She set down her wood, her hands shaking as she stacked the branches. The flames grew, light flickering against his weathered face, shadows carving deeper into the lines around his eyes. For a long while they sat in silence, the fire snapping, snow swirling outside. She pulled her knees close, watching the steam curl from her breath. He busied himself with the fire, then with a strip of dried meat pulled from his coat. He did not offer words, nor did he seem to expect any. Her thoughts churned. His words still rang in her ears, raw and indelible. "I can smell you're fertile." A stranger, a wild man, had named aloud what others had buried in whispers. The humiliation still burned, but beneath it pulsed a strange sense of recognition. When she dared to glance at him, she found his eyes upon her again, not cruel, not hungry, simply steady, as though he weighed her presence the way one weighs the promise of storm. She dropped her gaze quickly, ashamed of the warmth creeping into her cheeks. The fire crackled, smoke rising into the dark. Outside, the snow fell heavier, sealing them deeper into the wilderness. She realized, with a slow tightening in her chest, that whatever this night brought, it would be spent beside him. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, telling her heart to still, telling her thoughts to quiet. Yet when she closed her eyes, the last thing she saw was the pale glint of his eyes across the fire, watching her as though she were the only thing left alive in the storm. The storm did not break by morning. It pressed against the earth with a hunger that seemed endless, piling snow against the canvas lean-to until the poles groaned. When she opened her eyes, the world was dim with smoke and cold light, the fire little more than a bed of coals. The man was already awake. He crouched by the pit, coaxing the embers with dry moss. His breath fogged around his beard, his movements sure, deliberate. He had the manner of one who had repeated such rituals through countless winters, until tending flame was as natural as drawing breath. She lay still a moment, her body stiff on the ground, listening to the hiss of snow on canvas. The memory of his words in the night before clung to her skin like frost. She had dreamed of whispers, of eyes watching, of shame burning her like a brand. Yet when she looked at him now, she saw no malice, only a man-bound survival. Perhaps that made his bluntness all the more cutting. It was truth, without care for consequence. He noticed her stirring. "Wood," he said simply, nodding toward the dwindling stack. His voice was gravel, but not unkind. She pushed herself up, brushed snow from her braids, and fed a branch to the coals. Flame leapt, the cabin filling with the sharp smell of resin. For a long while neither spoke. The silence was not easy, but it was steady, like the rhythm of breathing. Later, he stepped outside, axe slung across his shoulder, vanishing into the curtain of white. She remained by the fire, mending the hem of her skirt with thread she kept in a small bundle of cloth. Her fingers were stiff, red from cold, but she worked with care. The act itself gave her calm, a reminder that she was more than some of their whispers, more than the shame pressed upon her. She was capable, and her hands proved it. When he returned, he dropped a heap of split logs beside the fire. Snow clung to his shoulders, his beard crusted white. He offered no words, only set about arranging the wood with the practiced efficiency of one who measured life in flames and ash. She watched him, curiosity threading through caution. There was strength in his arms, but more than brute force. Each swing of his axe, each stroke of his knife, carried patience. The hours bled together. He hunted, bringing back rabbits strung on a strip of hide. She cleaned them by the fire, her fingers sure with the blade, though the smell of blood made her stomach turn. He said nothing as she worked, but when she handed him the clean carcasses, their eyes met briefly. A flicker of recognition passed between them. Not approval, not thanks exactly, but acknowledgement. The firelight painted shadows on the canvas walls as evening crept in. He passed her a strip of cooked meat, the offering awkward, almost reluctant. She hesitated before taking it, fingers grazing his. The warmth of the food spread through her, but it was a brief touch that lingered, sparking something she did not dare name. Night deepened, the storm unbroken. He sat with his back against the logs, knife in hand, shaping wood into some crude tool. She watched the fire dance, eyes heavy, until he spoke again, his voice low. "They say you're cursed." The words were not a question. She stiffened, shame pressing once more into her chest. She could not meet his eyes. "They say many things. Yet you live." His tone held no judgment, only observation. Her lips tightened. Living is not the same as belonging. He said nothing more, yet she felt his gaze linger, steady and unflinching. The silence grew thick, but not cruel. She sensed that he knew something of exile, though his scars were hidden in other places. The days passed in his rhythm. He moved like a creature of habit, splitting wood, hunting, tending the fire. She filled the spaces between with smaller acts, stitching torn seams, boiling snow for water, gathering pine needles for tea. Their words were few, but their silences grew softer, less jagged. A strained companionship formed, not through declaration but through necessity, like two rivers running parallel beneath snow. One morning she woke to the sound of coughing. He was bent forward, shoulders shaking, his breath rattling in his chest. Alarm pricked her, though she masked it. She rummaged through her bundle, pulling dried herbs she had carried since autumn, bitter roots, leaves she had gathered from the high plains. She crushed them into a tin cup, poured in boiling water, and held it out. He eyed it warily, as though unaccustomed to another's care. Slowly he accepted. The steam rose between them, sharp and earthy. He drank, grimacing at the taste, but did not refuse. She watched, the act small yet significant, intending his cough. She felt a sliver worth return, not given by others but earned through her own hands. By evening his cough eased. He offered her the first bite of the hare he had roasted, setting it in her palm with surprising gentleness. She took it, their eyes locking briefly in the firelight. Something unspoken shifted between them, fragile, tentative. As the storm waned, the world outside grew brighter, the snow reflecting every glimmer of light until the landscape seemed carved from silver. Together they stepped beyond the shelter, the air crisp and clean. She bent to gather herbs poking through the drifts, her fingers numb but persistent. He watched her, expression unreadable. When she slipped on the ice, he moved quickly, steadying her with one calloused hand at her elbow. His touch was brief, but it sent a pulse through her chest that lasted long after. They returned to the fire, carrying the day's small winnings. She stitched the tear in his coat, each pull of the needle drawing fabric together. He sat still, eyes fixed not on the coat but on her hands, on the patience in her work. When she finished, he touched the mended seam, fingers brushing where hers had been. His gaze lifted, meeting hers for a breath too long. Neither spoke. That night, she found herself listening to the sound of his breathing as sleep settled in. The rhythm steadied her, anchoring her to the present. The memory of whispers in town felt farther away, muffled by snow. Here, in the wilderness, judgment lost its edge. Here, silence was not condemnation, but shelter. Yet even as warmth crept into her heart, fear lingered. She knew the world beyond the snow would not forgive her so easily. The town would still see her as cursed. The settlers would still whisper, and perhaps this wild man was no different from them. Perhaps his silence was only a mask of the same contempt. But when the fire burned low, he shifted closer, laying another log on the coals. The glow lit his face, rough and scarred by cold, yet softened by the flicker of light. He looked at her not as curse nor shame, but as something present, undeniable. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life not defined by whispers, but by what she chose to keep alive. As snow settled heavy outside, the fire between them glowed steady, each ember a fragile promise against the dark. The storm was not yet done, nor were the wounds within her, but something had taken root in the silence, a bond fragile as ice, yet stronger than the cold. When she finally closed her eyes, it was not with dread, but with the faintest trace of hope. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the snow piled at every door. The mountains stood glazed and white, ridges sharp as blades, trees bowed as though kneeling under the weight. Smoke curled thin from his fire, rising into the sky like a solitary signal. She stood at the doorway of the shelter, her breath trembling in the cold, eyes following the line of the trail that wound down toward the valley. Somewhere beyond those hills, the town whispered her name, shaping it into curses, grinding it into shame. She had thought the distance would silence them, but the echo carried even here. He returned with fresh tracks on his boots, carrying 2 hairs strung over his shoulder. He said little as he brushed snow from his coat, hanging the animals on a peg outside. She could not help herself. "They will speak of this," she said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the valley. He stopped, his pale gaze lifting to her, steady as the mountain itself. "They always speak." Her throat tightened. The words were true, but their weight did not ease. She turned away, crouching by the fire, stirring the embers. Flames licked upward, fragile and hungry, like the pulse of her own heart. The town's judgment felt like a hand on her throat, squeezing with invisible fingers. Even here, in the shelter of wilderness, she could feel their eyes upon her. He knelt to sharpen his knife, steel rasping against stone. "What does it matter?" he asked. She looked at him then, the question stirring something sharp inside. "It matters because they have taken everything from me already. My people, my place, the right to walk without shame. When a word is spoken enough, it becomes a chain. You of all men should know chains." His hand stilled. For a moment, only the hiss of snow slipping from the trees filled the air. Then he looked at her, and she saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Pain, old and buried, rising like smoke from long-dead embers. He said nothing, but the silence was thick with confession unspoken. That night the wind howled again, though the storm itself was gone. They huddled near the fire, its warmth thin against the vast cold pressing against the walls. The town's whispers haunted her, but here in the glow, another voice pressed against the silence. He reached for her shoulder once, brushing snow that had clung to her braid. His hand lingered a breath too long, then drew back. She felt it as though it had burned her. She lay awake long after, staring at the smoke hole where stars blinked faintly through the shifting dark. His presence on the other side of the fire was weight enough to keep her from sleep. She thought of the way his eyes had softened, the restraint in his touch. He was not a man who sought to take. He was a man who carried his hunger like a wound. The days crept on. Snow melted slowly from the roofs of the valley cabins, and word carried upward like a hawk on the wind. When she ventured near the edges of the settlement to trade herbs for salt, the women drew close to one another, whispering. A man spat into the snow as she passed. One muttered, "She lies with the beasts in the mountains." She kept her eyes forward, but the words cut deeper than frost. When she returned to the cabin, her silence betrayed her. He watched her unload her bundle, setting it down with shaking hands. "What did they say?" he asked. She laughed without mirth, the sound brittle, the same as always, that I am cursed, that I am unfit, that I am his whore. The last word broke from her lips like glass shattering. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed low. "And do you believe them?" Her breath caught. She wanted to say no, to throw their cruelty back into the snow, but shame coiled tight, strangling words before they could form. She lowered her eyes, and in that silence he understood her struggle. He reached across a narrow space, not to touch her, but to place a piece of bread in her palm. The gesture was simple, yet it steadied her, the way a rope steadies one crossing a river of ice. One evening, clouds gathered heavy again, promising more snow. They remained within the shelter, a stew simmering over the fire. The small room smelled of pine smoke and meat, of drying by the flames. She stitched a tear in his sleeve, needle flashing in the firelight. He watched her work, his rough hands resting idle for once. "You mend what is broken," he said softly. She glanced up, startled by the gentleness in his tone. Her fingers faltered on the thread. "I mend what I can." His eyes lingered on her, pale and searching. "Perhaps you do not see. But that is more than most can claim." Her breath caught at the words. For so long she'd been told she was ruin, burden, curse. To hear otherwise, even in his low and halting way, struck her deeper than any insult. She bowed her head, blinking against tears she would not let fall. The storm came that night, fiercer than before. Snow drove against the walls, rattling the logs, seeping in through every crack. They huddled close, not by choice but necessity, the fire burning low. Wind howled like wolves in the valley, drowning out thought. She pressed closer to the flames, her body trembling. He shifted beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. For a moment, she stiffened, then let the warmth seep into her bones. Neither spoke. Their breaths mingled in the dark, the silence holding more than words could carry. At last he broke it, voice low as the storm outside. "You are not cursed." She turned her head, startled, her face inches from his. The fire lit the planes of his cheek, the glint in his eyes. He did not look away. "The snow bows to you," he murmured. "Even the storm cannot drive you down. I have seen it." Her throat closed. No one had ever spoken to her that way. The world had called her shame. Yet here was a man the world called beast, naming her strength. Her heart ached with the weight of it. She did not answer. Instead, she turned back to the fire. But the heat on her skin was no longer only from the flames. The storm raged until morning, but in the small cabin something had shifted, quiet and irreversible. When dawn came, the world lay buried once more. Yet she rose with a steadiness she had not felt before. The whispers still waited in the valley, sharp as ever, but their grip on her had loosened. She had been called curse, but now she carried another truth inside her, one whispered not in cruelty, but in recognition. And though the road ahead promised more storms, she knew she would face them not as the woman bent beneath gossip, but as one who had heard her worth named in the hush of firelight. The storm had loosened its grip on the valley, but the world outside was still gripped in white silence, a silence broken only by the creak of timber and the steady hiss of wind through the eaves. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its light painting restless shadows on the walls. Grace sat hunched close to it, her shawl drawn tight across her shoulders, though no cloth could warm the chill gnawing at her. Across the room, Ethan paced, his boots scuffing against the rough-hewn planks, his face hard as cut stone. For days they had been bound here, thrown together by the blizzard, tethered by circumstance more than choice. But as the hours had passed, the truth had bled through silence. Old wounds had reopened, and the line between ally and adversary blurred with each glance, each word unspoken. Tonight, that line would not hold. "You've been keeping something from me," Ethan said at last, his voice low but sharp, like the edge of a whetted knife. Grace turned, meeting his stare. There was no tremor in her eyes, though her hands shook slightly as they lay in her lap. "And you haven't?" she answered, her tone calm, measured, yet carrying weight enough to strike. His jaw worked, but he didn't speak at once. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and studied her with the weariness of a man who had carried too many truths for too long. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air, and Grace felt each one like a memory-catching flame. "I know why you left Abilene," Ethan said finally. "The whispers followed you long before the snow did. Folks said you ran to hide shame. A child born without a father. A husband gone too soon, or maybe never real at all." Grace's breath hitched, though she fought to keep her composure. "And what do you believe?" she asked. "I believe," he said slowly, "that you don't belong to the lies they tell. But lies have a way of fastening to a woman in this land. And lies are all I've lived by since." His words broke there, his voice trailing into silence. The air grew heavier, pressing down with the weight of secrets untold. Grace rose from her chair, moving toward him, the firelight painting her face in a raw, unguarded glow. "Since Sarah?" she asked gently. The name hung in the cabin like a ghost, and Ethan's shoulders stiffened as though struck. He had not spoken his wife's name in years. Not aloud, not where memory might cut him to the quick. His eyes burned with something between fury and grief, but Grace did not retreat. "You're not the only one haunted," she whispered, "but we can't keep circling ghosts. Not when the world outside waits to devour the living." He turned sharply from her, stalking to the shuttered window, pushing it open just enough for icy wind to lash his face. Beyond, the valley was still buried, but the trail had begun to show beneath the thinning snow. And along it, faint but certain, were tracks, riders' tracks, cutting hard toward the cabin. "They're coming," Ethan muttered. Grace joined him, her breath clouding the glass. She saw them too, for horsemen, dark shapes against the white. They were moving with purpose, closing the distance fast. Her pulse quickened, but she steadied herself. "Who?" Ethan's answer was a curse under his breath. "Rennick's men. He never lets go of a debt." He looked at her then, the weight of decision hardening his gaze. "And did you know your past and mine would meet like this? Did you know he'd come?" Grace shook her head. "I knew only that running never ends it. I thought I might find a place here where the snow could bury the past." Ethan's laugh was bitter. "Snow buries nothing. It only covers until thaw." The hoofbeats grew louder, the rhythm of inevitability. Ethan moved quick now, pulling down the rifle from above the hearth, checking its chamber with practiced hands. Grace, too, braced herself, though she carried no weapon but resolve. "They'll burn us out if they can't break us." Ethan said, "We stand or we fall here. And if we fall?" Grace asked. He looked at her, truly looked, as though seeing her not as burden or stranger, but as someone bound his fate. "Then we fall together." The door shuddered on the first pounding blow, the wood rattling in its frame. A voice rang out, cruel and mocking, muffled through the storm. "Ethan Cole, you've had your day of running. Time to pay what you owe." Grace's heart thudded, but she stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Ethan lifted the rifle, his voice cutting strong through the cabin. "Debt's been paid in blood already. You want more? Come claim it." The door splintered on the second strike, then burst inward on the third. Cold wind rushed inside, carried with the stench of gunpowder and men hungry for violence. For figures filled the threshold, rifles raised, eyes sharp with malice. The first shot cracked like thunder, shattering the close air. Ethan fired true, dropping one man before his boots had crossed the threshold. The others surged forward, shouting curses, their weapons flashing. The cabin filled with smoke and the metallic sting of spent powder. Grace ducked low, grabbing the iron poker from the hearth. One of the men lunged at her, but she swung with desperate strength, the iron connecting with a sickening thud. He crumpled, howling, his rifle clattering to the floor. Ethan fought like a man possessed, the years of bitterness and loss burning out in the fire of survival. He dropped the second man with a clean shot to the chest, but not before a bullet tore across his arm, searing flesh and spilling blood. He staggered, teeth gritted against pain. The last man, Rennick himself, strode forward, a grin splitting his scarred face. "Cole," he sneered, "you always did think yourself better than the likes of us. Time you learned otherwise." Ethan raised his rifle, but Rennick fired first. The shot slammed into Ethan's side, driving him back against the wall. His breath came ragged, blood seeping through his shirt. Grace cried out, rushing to him, but Rennick advanced, revolver drawn, savoring the kill. "Guess the widow and her shame can keep you company in hell," Rennick said, leveling the barrel. But Grace moved quicker than he expected. She snatched up the fallen rifle, her hand steady though her heart thundered. She met Rennick's eyes with fierceness that burned past fear. "No," she said, voice ringing clear. "Not today." The shot she fired echoed through the cabin, louder than the storm, sharper than vengeance. Rennick staggered, eyes wide with shock, before collapsing into snow blowing through the open door. Silence followed, heavy and absolute, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the ragged sound of Ethan's breathing. Grace dropped the rifle, rushing to his side, pressing her hands to the wound in his side. His blood was hot against the palms, a stark contrast to the icy air. "Stay with me," she pleaded. "You don't get to leave me to ghosts." Ethan's eyes met hers, pain clouding them but not dimming the fire. I thought I was done for long ago," he whispered. "But you've kept me alive longer than I deserved." Tears burned her eyes, but she held them back, focusing on keeping pressure against the wound. "Deserve has nothing to do with it. We survive because we must. Together." The storm outside had quieted, the snow settling into stillness, as though the land itself had witnessed a reckoning and now sought peace. The cabin, battered and bloodied, stood as fragile shelter, but within its walls something had shifted. The ghosts had been faced, debts paid, lies burned away in the fire of survival. Ethan winced, but a faint smile touched his lips. "Reckon the thaw might hold more than just mud this year." Grace held his hand, her grip steady, her gaze unflinching. "Then let's see it through. No more running. No more hiding." Outside, dawn began to break, the first fragile rays of sun piercing the storm's aftermath, glinting on the snow like shards of promise. Within the cabin, two souls bound by scars and survival clung to life, not as strangers, not as fugitives, but as something forged anew in fire and blood. Whatever lay beyond the thaw, they would face it not as shadows of the past, but as the last light still burning against the dark.